you're wondering what we're doing a series called Beyond Religion, and it's going to be a 3-week series, and it's based out of Acts chapter 7. And so Acts chapter 7 is a chapter which is almost like the longest sermon in the book of Acts, and we're not going to be able to hit every verse, but there's a theme that runs through it. A guy named Stephen, he's become a believer in Jesus, and maybe some of you are here and you're exploring that and you're wondering about it. We're glad that you're here. And he gets up and he goes through the Old Testament, and he's trying to prove to the people he's on trial in front of that the idea that religion is over. It had its place, it had its time, it was really important for a season. There was all these sacred rituals and sacred land and all of these religious things of certain days that you'd set aside and foods you would eat, and all these things had their place for thousands of years. They would mark out the people of God. But now that Jesus Christ has come, now that he lived a perfect life, now that he died on a cross and rose again and said from the cross, "It is finished," all of that's over, and now it's expanded out to all people groups of the world. It's not just a group of Jews living in a certain land. All the Gentiles can now become part of the people of God through Jesus. And so so the people, of course, are fighting against this, and they're saying, no, we don't like any of this idea. And he wants to show them this has always been something that God has been doing, even all through the Old Testament. And he uses, we're going to hone in on 3 people. He goes through a whole bunch of different Old Testament stories. So it's kind of a little Old Testament series too. But he goes through, we're going to look at Abraham, and then next week, Joseph, and then the week after, Solomon. And he kind of makes the same point out of all 3 stories, that God has always wanted to shut down religion in the sense that it would run your life. And, because it was always pointing to a time when freedom would come, when walking in freedom away from some of that stuff would actually happen. And what a weird thing, he goes on to say, is if we go back to religion. And some of you grew up in religious settings. You grew up in a setting where you had to go to church, and you had to do this, and you couldn't watch rated R movies or something, and you couldn't say these certain words. But if you said these words and didn't say then God would love you. Then God would let you into heaven one day. And some of you, even if you grew up in the church, or you not even coming out of different religions, just been around Christianity, you think, yeah, I need to do this and do this and do this. And that's a religious mindset. And it kind of hinders your life. And what we're going to see is that Jesus wants freedom for you, even for those of you who've grown up in church. I didn't grow up in church. I first came to church when I was 19 years old, but right when I entered the church, I got this sense of like, this is the way you're supposed to do it, and this is what you're not supposed to do. And I was a non-Christian kid, and so I smoking my cigarettes and wearing baggy pants and whatever. And so they looked at me and they said, there's all these rules to follow, and you don't follow them, ergo, you're not a Christian. A guy walked up to my girlfriend and said, Mark's not a Christian because I saw him smoking out back at the church. And she's like, well, what was he smoking? And he's like, well, cigarettes. Oh, great. That's better than what he used to smoke, because I used to be the drug guy and, all of that. And so some of you, that's probably your story too. But God can take people like us and save us and use us and do awesome things. And that's the great beauty of the grace of God. And so here's the picture I want to give you. So when when my wife got pregnant with our first child, it was 2006 that she was born, and we were living in Vancouver, and we had to we went to this thing called UC Baby, and it was basically where you would see the baby like in utero, and it wasn't like just the black and white, like fuzzy, I don't know what that is. It was like a colored, and there was like Mozart music playing, and it was like a 1-hour experience where you got to see the baby in the womb. And then they gave you a DVD. So we took this DVD and we brought it home, and we used to watch it all the time. We used to put the DVD in, and oh my gosh, there's our baby. Friends would come over for like a meal, and we'd be like eating, and we'd be like, look here, watch our baby. And they'd be like, yeah, that was good. 5 minutes. And no, this is 45 minutes, man. And it was like, we're going to watch this weird video for, yeah, that's our baby. And we used to watch it all the time. And then in August 2006, our baby was born. And the image I think about often is like, imagine once she was born, I just kept going back and watching the DVD. Instead of interacting with her like live as a person, I just kept putting the DVD on. But the DVD was a pointer, and now the real thing has come. And would it be weird if I just kept going back to this? And that's the image that Stephen wants to give in this sermon. He wants to go, there was a time when all these rules mattered, and they set things up, but now the time of freedom and Jesus Christ has come. why don't you accept it? And it's going to be something that you and I got to challenge ourselves on. Have we actually accepted the freedom that Jesus wants to give in our life, or are we continuing to put religion on us? So that's kind of the idea of what the next 3 weeks is about. So if you got a Bible, Acts chapter 7, but we got to set up why he's on trial. So Acts chapter 6, just the last couple of verses of Acts chapter 6, it says, they seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. In verse 13, they produced false witness. So have you ever, just right there, if you got a Bible, underline false witnesses, or like, have you ever had someone be a false witness against you? It's pretty painful. And this is something actually this is what I love about the Bible. It's super relevant to like modern times. It's like, it's not just some ancient thing that's like, oh, the Bible. It's like false witness is how we live every day because of social media, right? My wife posts something on social media. People are like, you homeschool your kids? I can't believe it. You don't even know how to use a comma. It's like, what made you wake up in the morning thinking you have to criticize someone because of their punctuation on social media? Like, are you really that person? Come on. You got to wake up and realize you're in a pretty dark place. But this is part of modern life. Constant criticism, constant negativity. We love it because it makes us feel good. And there's been people, I mean, I've had so many scenarios. I've been a leader for, 20 years. And so being a leader, you're constantly criticized about everything, right? Like Steve Jobs said, if you never want to be criticized in life, don't become a leader, just sell ice cream for a living, because nobody hates the person selling them ice cream, right? It's just, I'm licking that sugary, oh, I love you. But I was leading my own church for a bunch of years. And it was like, I remember during COVID, people would send me emails and it was like, we got to do this. We better open, because if we don't open our church right now, it means we're being run by the government. And that was, one email, and you better not get anybody to get a vaccine. And then the next email would be, hey, I'm a doctor. I go to your church and we better be closed, because if you don't close the church down, it means, Mark, that you hate old people and you want everyone over 70 to die a horrible death. And everybody better get vaccines. And it was like every day. And so constant criticism. I remember I had let a staff member go a few years ago, and they started going around and kind of slandering us around the community, lying about us. And it was like my default setting was trying to defend myself. And this is the difference. Like, why, when you're criticized, think about this for a minute. When you're criticized, maybe a family member, a friend, or social media, whatever, you constantly feel the need to defend yourself. And that's because you're still living in the religious era. Because the religious era, and this is where the beautiful psychology of religion versus Jesus comes in, because the religious era says, I need to look good in front of the world. I need to justify my life in front of everybody by being a good person, by being a successful person, by being someone with a good reputation, or being a pure person, or someone who doesn't make mistakes. And the minute someone criticizes you, that gets threatened. So your tendency then is to defend yourself. And what Jesus ends up doing is you end up getting your identity so rooted in Jesus that the world can't affect you like that. It doesn't matter, even when, because how many of us, if we're dead honest, are people who make mistakes. We feel like a jerk sometimes. We feel like a loser. Maybe some of you watching this right now, you've messed up at work, or you've messed up your family, and you're like, I don't know where I'm going. I've made so many mistakes. I don't think God loves me. I don't think God can use me. And that's life. And the longer you live it in Jesus, the longer you realize, man, he uses you not because of you, but in spite of you. And it's something we've talked about before in different series but it's a message all the way through the Bible, even here. I think about, 5 or 6 months ago, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the church, Saddleback Church. Okay, Saddleback Church is this huge church in America, in California, and it's one of the biggest churches in America. And it's like one of the most popular. Like, the pastor wrote this book called Purpose Driven Life, and Rick Warren, and it blew up. And the church, tens of thousands of people, and changed evangelism and how everything's done in the church world in America for years and years and years. And I used to read these books. So 6 months ago, I was asked to preach at Saddleback Church. And I'm like, preach at Saddleback? This is the Super Bowl for preachers. This is like, oh my goodness. So I'm going to make it all perfect. I'm going to do everything. Every sentence and everything's going to be thought through, every story. And I'll just be a good boy on my good behavior at Saddleback Church, because I want the acclaim of Saddleback. I want to be invited back to Saddleback Church. So I get there and I'm preaching about the Apostle Paul and how, and I say, Apostle Paul, some of you come in here, you think that you've messed up your life. But the Apostle Paul, man, he was a murderer. And how many of you in this room are murderers? Raise up your hand, right? And I'm, trying to make this point about like, all right, so if you've never murdered anyone, you're ahead of the Apostle Paul. And so, first service, how many of you are murderers, right? Second service, how many of you are murderers? Yeah. And then third service, I'm like, how many of you are murderers? And I look over in the corner of my eye, I see a hand go up. And I'm like, right? And I'm like, whoa. And I look, and I'm like on the stage of Saddleback, I'm like, thank you, lady. Thank you for your honesty. And I'm like, and then I realized it was the sign language lady. All right. It was the lady who was sign languaging my whole sermon to a group of people. And of course, she's like, oh, the Apostle Paul, do you ever murdered anyone? Raise your hand up if you've ever murdered anyone. And I'm like, right? And it's like, what are you doing? And I learned in this moment, like you just made a massive mistake at Saddleback, but God, how many of us know right now in this room, and I know you're not big ameners, but how many of us know that God can redeem stupid, right? Give it up if you think God can redeem stupid. Yes, and it's a beautiful thing because he takes our lives and all our mistakes and all the false witness bared against us and all the true messed up stuff we've done. And he goes, no, I can redeem this. I can do something with this. And so it says this, the rest of verse 13 said that he was testifying, this fellow, this is Acts chapter 6 now, never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. So the holy place and the law were the two things within Judaism that were like the center of their whole religion, right? The holy place, the temple, and then the law, the Bible. And what they're saying is that Stephen, in preaching the gospel of Jesus, is actually speaking against those two things. Now, of course, Stephen's just doing what Jesus did in his ministry. He got up against the temple and he said, this temple is going to come down because everything it's symbolized has become corrupt, right? There's one of the great moments, you remember he flips over the table, and we kind of read through that. We're like, yeah, he's just flipping over a table at a market. And it's like, no, this is the central symbol. This would be like Jesus saying, giving some symbol about the White House blowing up or the Parliament buildings for Canada. This place has become so corrupt that it's going to come down one day. It's like, no, he's a terrorist. Make sure he's on the list and, follow him around. Make sure. This is what he's doing. He's taking these central things and he's saying, hey, they had their time, but now it's over. It's the picture of John chapter 2, where Jesus goes to the wedding at Cana, and the first miracle is that he takes the water and he turns it into wine. And we're like, oh, that's a great story about Jesus liking wine or whatever. And then we move on with our life. But you got to pay attention to the details. In John 2, John tells us what the water jars were actually made. They were used for the Jewish purification rituals. And what he's trying to say is Jesus is taking the Jewish purification, and he's superseding them now, and he's creating the new era of wine versus the old era of water, and he's saying something new has come about, and so I know this guy. He has this tattoo, and it runs down his arm, and it says Leviticus 19:28, and of course people come up and they say, what does that tattoo say? What is Leviticus 19:28? And of course, it's the passage in the Bible that says, do not put a tattoo on your body. I am the Lord, right? And so they're like, and it releases all these gospel conversations where there was a time when this was actually legit, but now the time of Jesus has come, and that era is over, where there's certain foods and certain areas that are sacred, and certain this and certain that. My friend had there was a religious guy who showed up at his front door the other day and knocked on it. One of the religious groups that come and knock on your door and tell you, things about God. And he started chatting with him a little bit, and the guy said that years ago his church basically kicked him out, exiled him, and he was, part of this small little church, and he was very controlling. And the reason they did it, and they said they instructed my wife to leave me and take the kids or whatever, and it was all because he smoked cigarettes, and they said, this is so unrighteous that you need to leave him. And the wife left and the kids left, and he's sitting talking to my friend about it, and he's crying, he's sobbing, because this is the weight and squeeze of religion, that we start believing we can do these things and tweak these things. And the beauty of the gospel is it's moving into an era with us not real. So my daughter, years ago, my wife was away and she was hanging out with some girlfriends, and we were about to go out in the car, and my youngest daughter said, "Hey Dad, can I make some hot chocolate?" And I'm like, "Absolutely not. You can't make hot chocolate because I know what's going to happen. You're going to spill it somewhere, and I don't want to be cleaning up hot chocolate on the carpet right now. Like, I'm just trying to be a dad to 3 daughters without a wife. This is crazy," right? And so I go upstairs to take a shower, and I come downstairs and I see that there's powder all over the counter. And I'm like, oh gosh, she's made hot chocolate. So as I'm walking through the kitchen, I hear them giggling near the front door, standing on the carpet. And then all of a sudden I hear, and and I already know what's happening. I hear, and there's hot chocolate all over the floor. I come around the corner, I'm like, what? And I start to go into like 80s dad mode, right? Like I grew up where it's like my parents were like, yeah, get out of here. So I'm like, what are you doing? Don't you understand? And I'm like, look, come on, man, you gotta be a woman. Life's not gonna give you rails. You better grow up. You're gonna be 30 years old. No one's gonna ever wanna marry you. You know, whatever. I don't know. I just start to light her up and just be like, you need to do this and you need to do that with your life and you clean this up. And all of a sudden my phone lights up and it's a text from my wife. And it simply says, remember, relationship over rules. And I'm like, oh my gosh. First off, one of these moron kids just texted my wife and told her I was fighting with our youngest daughter, which is a problem. But I always remembered that line, relationship over rules. And those of you who have kids, you know that that's the key to the whole thing. This is what God has done in salvation history. There was a time, of course he had a relationship, but he had set up these rules, and now that time is given way to this time of Jesus and freedom and relationship and walking with God. And so now in chapter 7, it says this, he gets up, Stephen gets up after these people have put him on trial. And in chapter 7, he says this, verse 1 and 2, Father, and he starts to defend himself, and he cites the first Old Testament story we're going to talk about. Father Abraham, while he was still in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. So he starts to go through the Old Testament story to show them everything I've been saying. There's nothing new about this. So he cites Abraham, who obviously they love. And he says he didn't grow up in the land of Israel, this sacred promised land that you all love, this with the holy temple and the holy law. That stuff wasn't even around yet. He lived in Mesopotamia. He didn't live in Haran yet. He actually grew up there. And what I love about this is it's saying that Christianity doesn't have, he's trying to make this point, that in the era of Jesus, there's no sacred spaces, right? There's no certain land that's more sacred than others. There's no, we don't have to go to temples, and go, okay, God is here. It's like, now it's the whole world is God's and everything in it. And so I remember it's kind of beautiful that God will use any old land. That's kind of his point. He just lived in Mesopotamia, and Abraham, like, it's like you and me, like some of you think you're not good enough for God to use you. And I didn't think that when I was the kid who grew up with a divorced family and got Tourette's syndrome when I was a kid and still have it today, which is why I twitch and do weird habits and all of that. My dad abandoned us. He died when I was 15 and never even told us that he was sick. And that wounds you. Like, you got daddy issues from that. Some of you sitting here watching this right now, you got daddy issues. You think, man, God doesn't want to do anything with me because I'm not a perfect person. And I think part of Stephen's point is, well, either was Abraham, because we know that, but he didn't come from a perfect place. Mesopotamia wasn't the sacred turf. God he starts this and he does something else with it. And I think, you've probably heard, and this isn't meant to be crass, but you've probably heard the joke, making a point. You probably heard the joke, I'm sweating like a hooker in church. I don't know, maybe you have heard that or haven't heard that. I'm sweating like a hooker in church, right? And what that's meant by is, this person who's done these immoral things or is doing these immoral things shows up to church, where at church everyone's holy and everybody's perfect, and there's a sacred space in this where the seats and chairs and lights and screens are, and that's so sacred that you get there and you feel unrighteous, and so you start to sweat of the shame and the guilt. And the beautiful part of the gospel and the story of Jesus is that when you read the story of Jesus, you realize he hung out with prostitutes all the time. And if you are indeed, and I'm not kidding, if you are indeed involved in that industry, some of you might feel the shame and the guilt as if Jesus would never love you. And I want to say he would actually be sitting with you in church. He'd be the one spending time with you, leaning in, hearing your story. There's a moment in the Gospels where they're looking at a woman like that. And I just remember this line in the Gospel of Luke, and he just looks at his disciples. He says, do you see this woman? And of course, he's not asking, do you see her? Like, do you have eyeballs? Do you really see her? Like, do you see her? Do you see her story? Do you see her life? And some of you feel so immoral and impure in your seat right now. We're watching this online, part of Connexus Church. You think, no, God uses righteous people. God uses perfect people. He doesn't use people with the shame and the guilt of the mistakes and sins I've made, no matter what age or stage. And the underlying idea here is Stephen's going, he does. He takes you in the Mesopotamias of your life where it's not sacred space and you're not perfect yet. And he says, I'm going to do something with you. I want to use you to do something great. I want to give you a fresh start. Today is a day where you can turn it all around and say, my new identity is in Christ. It's not based on the shame and the guilt and the mistakes I've made. So verse 3, God shows up to Abraham and he goes, okay, Abraham, I'm going to use you. Even though you live in Mesopotamia, you're not in the sacred space, you're not perfect. And he says, leave your country and your people, verse 3, and go to the land I will show you. So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. And after the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you're now living. Notice this argument he's making, this sacred land that you all love. And he gave him no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though in that time Abraham had no child. And it's beautiful because he doesn't have any children. He's super old and he's going life of faith, life of faith. There's things that God is going to do that you can't even see in your life yet, but are you going to believe him and trust him that he's going to do it and it's going to be beautiful? And it took him to move away from his own country, verse 3 says. Move away from everything that is comfortable and easy and the things that you know. Is this where you're at in life? Are you willing to go, God, I'm willing to follow you in faith to the places that are uncomfortable, the places that aren't going to be easy. When we moved from Toronto to Vancouver in 2004, we knew nobody. We packed up our whole life. We got married in December, and then in July, we packed up our whole life and got in a car and drove across the country to Vancouver, and because I was going to go to school for a couple of years. And we settled in to a place we had no idea what we were doing. We got there and we took the top floor of a triplex. We had no idea. We'd never even been there. We didn't know anybody. And the first night we're threw our little mattress on the ground. And I'm like, what is that smell? And some guy was smoking weed right under us and filled our whole apartment with the weed smoke. And we're hotboxing our house. And we're like, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. I want potato chips. I got to get out of here. And so we got out of there after 2 or 3 days. Well, my wife was crying, why did you bring me here? But it was in those moments of difficulty and tears and pain and loneliness and isolation that we prayed more together as a couple than we ever had. That growth personally came about because of the pain. And here's what we got. Leave your country. Leave. Maybe the thing that's tripping you up, maybe the thing that is keeping you in the sin and in the habits that are destroying your life is the familiar, is the comfortable place you are, the comfortable people that you're around, the comfortable rhythms of your life that you're finding it hard to break. And those things are actually fighting against your desire to become more like Jesus. And you got to be shooken up and go, oh yeah, maybe I got to leave the country or whatever that is, leave the country that I'm comfortable in, leave the people group, the friend group, the rhythm, the pattern, the thing, and go where God will meet me, even though I'm scared to go there. He's going to meet me there. He's going to show up there. But it's going to be hard. It's going to feel difficult. So a bunch of years ago, we were in Palm Springs on a little Christmas vacation thing. We'd gone down there with some friends, and beside their pool, they had this big cactus. And my middle daughter, Hayden, ran out and tripped over something and literally fell into the cactus. All right, it's ugh. And these huge needles went all into her arm and down her side. And just, she's like, ah! She's 7 or 8 at the time. Ah! She's screaming. So my wife's like, okay, let's get her to the emergency room. So they start packing up to go to the emergency room. And I, in all my calmness, went to the internet instead, right? Because that's got all the answers. And I just said, hey, what do you do, internet, where cactuses get into your body? And it said, well, here's what you do. You take Elmer's glue, like white, goopy glue that we use in kindergarten, and you cover the spot with Elmer's glue. Then you let it dry, and then you walk up and you rip it off, right? All the needles will come out. You just rip it off. And I'm like, okay. So I walked in. I said, everyone calm down. I have the answers. I know what we need to do. Honey, grab the Elmer's glue. We need to cover her body in glue, let it dry, and then rip it off. Easy. And of course, my wife looked at me and went, are you an idiot? You think we're going to do this to our 70? Are you crazy? They all jumped in the car and they went to the emergency room. And they sat there for 6 hours. Yes, Canadians, down here in America, I know we're told all these stories. Oh, the emergency room, you just fly through there like a drive-through. Canada's so bad. There's such long waits. There was a 6-hour wait in America, right? So they're in Boston, they're in the emergency room, and finally they get to see the doctor, and the doctor looks at her and he looks at my wife and says, here's what you need to do. You need to get some Elmer's glue. You need to cover the whole spot in Elmer's glue. You need to let it dry, and then you need to rip it off, right? And I look like a genius. And I was like, okay, see guys, you got to listen to me more. Think about, there was this guy I saw on TV a bit ago, and he had been in rehab. He'd been a drug addict and an alcoholic. And he said that the way he got free from all of that, and sub this in for whatever sin or thing that you're trying to deal with in your life. He said his mentor looked at him one day and he said, the only way you're going to get to freedom, the only way this is ever going to work, is if you are willing to hug the cactus. And what he meant by that is you gotta lean into pain sometimes in order to get to the freedom of the place you got to go. And this is Abraham's story. You got to leave the country. You got to maybe hone into some rhythms and patterns and relationships and things that are going to feel painful now for the short time, but the long time benefit will change your life. And I'll say I've literally left my country coming down here to Sacramento, California, and it hasn't been easy. There's Canadian American stuff. There's visa stuff. There's all kinds of stresses. All my kids had to leave their whole friend group and come down here. It wasn't easy. My middle daughter, it took probably a year or two before she really got any friends. And it was like, there was a while where a guy down here is like, hey, I know your daughter loved horses, so I have a horse and it's on my property. Why doesn't she come and ride it? And finally she was happy. And it was like, thank you, Dad. She'd go ride the horse every single day and she'd lay on it and talk to it about her problems, say, you're my best friend. I don't have any friends here. I had to leave my country and I love you, horsey, blah. And she did that. And then finally one day we got a phone call and he's like, hey, you got to come up here. The horse is dying. And I'm like, no. And we went up there and the horse was sitting there dying. And like, as my daughter walked up to it, it like lifted its head for the last time and its eyes kind of, and then it died right in her arms. I'm like, what? Why, Dad? Does God take everything I love? And it's like, how do you deal with these questions? It's like, it'd be easier to just go back to Canada. Just go back. Don't leave your own country. Go all these unknown things. And yet, I've seen God show up over and over and over again in their lives. It just took a while. It's that gap of information. It's that gap of time where now they're more settled and flourishing than they've ever been. And I'm seeing God use things down here that never, and you go, okay, I got to trust in the God of the universe here because I don't know what I'm doing. And some of you feel you're like so in control of your life, you would never be able to let go and let God lead you to where he wants to bring you. And that's the challenge of the story that he's raising. And so he raises this story. And of course he mentions Abraham and he says, are you willing to follow God where he's going to lead you? And I'll end with this picture. The reason some of us don't want to follow God where he's leading us is because we want to be in control of our lives. Some of you, that's your sin. That's your idol. It's not, the big power and sex and, all this. It's just, you want to be in control of all things. You want to control your family. You want to control your spouse. You want to control your workplace. You want to control everybody you want to control every circumstance and event and thing in your life. And God's going, man, you got to leave. You got to open your hand here. And what that's about is a view of the world. So I'll give you this image and then I'll pray for you. It's the difference, as one writer has said, between cat theology and dog theology. What I mean by that is this. How many of you in these rooms are watching this? Raise up your hand if you own a cat. All right, I know sometimes it's hard to admit it. All right, I can see you. Yeah, okay, good. You got a cat, beautiful. Now, how many of you own a dog? Raise up your hand real high, a dog, right? More dogs, people in the room, right? So I own both. My daughter's got a cat, sits up in her room most of the day, and then we got a dog. So, or two dogs. So here's how a dog works, okay? A dog looks at you and says, this master of mine feeds me, loves me, provides for me, cleans up after me, comforts me. Ergo, he or she must be God. So the provision, so I'm going to serve them and love them. So that's why when you walk in the door, your dog like greets you and loves you and licks you and just a cat, however, a cat says, this person feeds me, loves me, provides for me, cleans up after me, comforts me. Ergo, I must be God because all this good stuff in my life. And so that's why when you get home, your dog runs up to you and loves you, and your cat is just sitting there way up on some shelf somewhere like, feed me, slave. All right. And it's like, do something for, it's like a cat thinks that it's God because you serve it. And a dog recognizes because you serve it, it should serve you. And some of us watching this right now, you think you see God and all of his love and all of his provision and what he's done in Jesus even, and you go, man, I must be so important that I can control the universe. I can control my life. I'm the center of the story of all things. And what Stephen just did is even the Abrahams, these superstars of our story, it was God grabbing them when they lived in Mesopotamia, when they were a nobody, and moving them to a place, and they risked going there, and they trusted him, that he's the center of the story. And the reason he provides and loves is not so that you can take on the problems of the world and be God. It's so that you can recognize that he is God, and you put your whole life in his hands. And some of us, that's exactly what we need to do right now. And so I'll just take a minute on this first week of Beyond Religion. Close your eyes. And just think of the areas of your life where you're trying to control too much because you don't trust him to take care of it. And just release that one sphere of your life to him. God, I pray that people in this, watching this or in these rooms, Connexus Church, would feel the freedom that Abraham felt when you called him to leave the comfortable and the things he knew. And God, how beautiful a picture that, of course, Jesus Christ left all that was comfortable and what he knew in heaven and became a human being and died on a cross for our sin and rose again. And I pray that we, watching this, would feel the freedom of our own life from the sacrifice and victory of Jesus, and our identity would shift, that we would understand no matter what our circumstances in life, that you have called us into a freedom in our identity and our purpose, that us being in control would only crush us. The shame, the guilt would remain with us, but in Christ it's gone. And we're willing to trust you and go to the places you're calling us to go, to flourish instead of flounder in life. Put your finger on that and let us respond and listen and be obedient to it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.